Yeah, good afternoon, and thanks for coming along to this webinar that's kind of jointly brought to you by Construction Health and Safety New Zealand, the Construction Sector Accord, and Tonkin and Taylor. The purpose of this webinar is really to talk about a piece of work that we've been on with since, I was looking at it today, since July 2020, which is some time ago we started this conversation about health and safety by design. So the idea really this afternoon is just to talk about a report that we jointly commissioned with the Construction Sector Accord and Tonkin and Taylor, and just to talk about some of the key findings and introduce you to some of the people that have been involved in the work. So I'll quickly just go through the agenda then. So in a moment, what we'll do is I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll talk about why we've started this work and why we think it's important for industry. Then Anna and Russ, who are going to introduce themselves in a moment, will go through some of the key findings, and then we'll have an opportunity to talk about where we roughly think we might go in the future, and then provide an opportunity for questions, answers, feedback, comments, discussion at the end, really. Just calling out the point that we're going to have and you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, you should see that there's a chat function that's going to be open throughout the webinar. So you don't need to wait until the end for your questions. If you've got something on your mind, tap it in. We've got a team working behind the scenes who's going to monitor those. So we will try and get to all your questions and provide an answer. At the end, if you want to speak, I'm sure we can arrange for you to ask a question in person. For those of you that are a bit more shy, just type it in, and we'll go from there. The other thing really is just to bear in mind and keep in your heads. One of the things we quite like from the audience for this webinar is to think about where you might want to see us focus as we move forwards in the future. A key part of this is that producing the report is only their first side. We don't think that we have all the answers and we know everything. So if there's anything from the report that you think we could add to, or you've got particular insights you can add, we would welcome those, because we certainly don't think that we know everything. But also as well, as we go through the content, if you think there are key things that you think that we should be thinking about in the future and working more on, then we'd really welcome that insight and that direction from you too. So just really a quick plug, beginning with some thanks and acknowledgements really to our authors. So Anna, who's on the panel, who's going to introduce herself in a moment, Anna Galvin, and also Dr. Richard Donnelly, who unfortunately was unable to attend. He's on holiday. I think after writing this report, he just needed a rest. So he's handed the rugby ball to Anna. Just a real call out to our two authors, because they've actually worked incredibly hard. And for those of you that have read the report, will see that it's not an insignificant piece of work. That 130 odd pages, I think, at last count. I might even be wrong, it might be more. So thank you very much to the authors. Just wanted to call out a few other acknowledgements and thanks as well, which is already mentioned the Construction Sector Accord and Tonkin and Taylor for helping us fund this work, and also as well the steering group, the three panel members. In addition to the three panel members, we also had Marcus Hogan from the New Zealand Institute of Architects on our steering group, who's now working at Lees Construction, Dave Moore, formerly of WorkSafe, and Charlene Mathen from WorkSafe, who played a key part in helping us get this report finalised, particularly Charlene, who did our technical review, which we're really grateful for, and Richard Stone from MB, who works on the Construction Sector Accord, who's got specific experience and expertise in this place and really helped us. So thank you to them, and just thank you to you, the audience, for taking some time out to dial into this webinar and join us. Okay, so before we carry on then, I'll just hand over to Anna and Russ and Doug to briefly introduce themselves and let you know what they're about. Anna.
Okay, hi. So including around 8 years in independent consulting, I've worked predominantly in construction, ports, rail, mining industries over the last 20 years or so. That was after completing a civil engineering degree. Yeah, and I tend to be involved in larger and complex programs, projects, and operations stuff. And yeah, that I have worked in in the health and safety space since the reform bill came in, but also prior to that I was working in mining, which did have a strong health and safety focus. And even prior to July 2020, I think when you mentioned we started, we'd been talking about health and safety by design, and I have also done some independent work in that space as well. So yeah, I have a strong interest in this area.
Thanks, Anna. And Russ, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, good morning to everyone. Yeah, so I'm Russell McMullen. My background, I've worked about 30 years in the realm of safe systems and system safety, principally as an engineer in military aviation, with a heavy focus on aircraft system safety. After that, I moved into high-risk sector consulting, including some work across civil aviation, maritime and rail. And in 2019, I completed a master's degree, which focused on safety and design and transport infrastructure. And that's really how I got hooked into this piece of work, working across, as part of the panel overseeing the work. Subsequently, I've turned that previous research into the focus for my PhD, which I'm doing part-time. My normal day job, I'm one of the general managers at City Rail Link Limited, where I focus on the safe systems that we are aiming to provide for the New Zealand's largest infrastructure project. That's me, thanks.
Thanks, Russ. And last but definitely not least is Doug.
Kia ora. Thank you, John, for the introduction. Yeah, Doug Johnson. I started my working career back in the early 80s working on Clyde Dam as an engineer and geologist, and went on to advance in engineering geology and geotechnical engineering, which saw me join Tonkin Taylor in '95. And for a period of 11 years, I was managing director of the Tonkin Taylor Group. Recently stepped down from that role. And so my background sees me working in design and investigations and assessment through a range of projects, ranging from a lot of mining, quarry and road infrastructure, rail tunnel, as well as landslide and flood management, which is interesting and appropriate today. And I suppose I also sit on the steering group for the first version and now the second version of the steering group Accord. And I'm also a trustee board member for CHASNZ. And I suppose it's through those conversations that started a series of questions which the CHASNZ board and a number of people on the panel here involved in this project were talking about. And I think it might have started in 2019, Anna and Richard, you're quite right. We were sitting around a table saying, well, New Zealand's health and safety statistics aren't getting any better. And you know, a lot of work actually happens and it's becoming a discussion point across boardrooms around project tables, and you start meetings and there's a safety message at the first, and there's a lot of attention being given to it. And I suppose one of the questions we asked is that why aren't we getting better when the attention? So clearly we're either not doing the right things, or the things we're not doing aren't actually having the effect we want them to do. And I suppose looking at that from a designer lens, really started to think about, well, the designer interfaces quite strongly with the supply chain, right from concept right the way through to final delivery, and quite often into decommissioning. And I suppose it was a chance to say, well, actually, we also do a lot of work in the artifact generation. So we actually do a lot of task of looking at how do we, you know, implement safety practices in our design, and we produce lots of artifacts which are transferred up and down the supply chain to help decision making. And I suppose it came to the question is, whilst we might work hard in the artifacts, are we actually being effective? And are the decisions being made, which are critical to safety, actually considering enough elements in the design critical phases? And are those safety considerations actually getting to the point where they're actually making meaningful impact on some design decisions? We all have opinions on it, but we didn't actually know the answers ourselves, because there's a lot of variable practice. There's some really good stuff going on, and there's some also stuff which is probably not quite so good, was our thought. So to actually have some factual information to work forward, we actually then commissioned this report through with support from the Accord Steering Group and CHASNZ. And so that's how the report came to be. And we've really learned a lot through the process, and a few things we expected to see, we've seen, and a few things we didn't expect to see, we've discovered, which is always a great way to go. And we've got a few questions which came out of the work, and so I suppose we'll leave those to the end. But wanting to make a difference and say, how can we actually be better? What was the basis of funding this report and getting it underway? So with that in mind, it's probably appropriate to move on to the report coverage, John, and I'll hand over to Anna.
So as part of the research, Richard and I looked at 34 New Zealand and international health and safety by design guidance documents, and we reviewed them to identify common functions and principles of health and safety by design. And then we set out to discover how health and safety by design is practiced in the real world compared to this the idealized model described in the guidance. So to do this, we conducted interviews with 39 construction sector participants. That included design managers, health and safety by design specialists, client officers and senior management, project managers, quantity surveyors, constructors, facilities and property managers. So we tried to get some breadth of people there. And data collection analysis happened between November 2021 and to July 2022. So the guidance literature essentially defines health and safety by design as a safety risk assessment done occasionally during design. So it is explicitly positioned as somehow essential to producing a healthy and safe design, and for that matter, discharging designers' duties under the Health and Safety at Work Act. So this is a common misconception and just one of many that we encountered during the study. So these myths and misconceptions that are presented on the slide are perpetuated by, and these are just some of them, are perpetuated by the way we think and talk about design, construction projects, and the people exposed to harm. So it's important to address these myths and misconceptions because they impact our ability to understand how harm can be reduced and therefore where and how to intervene. So Russell and I will touch on a few of these myths and misconceptions in this presentation.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Anna. As John mentioned earlier, Richard Donnelly isn't available today, so I'm really just standing in on his behalf. So thanks. So looking at this slide, what we're really trying to communicate is that from a health and safety and design perspective, there's an idea that a good design can eliminate and minimize many of the risks that those that create and interact with the final asset might face. And the report refers to these people as the downstream stakeholders, represented by the little orange people there, and the designers being the people in green. The downstream stakeholders are all of those that have experience of working with and using the thing being designed or in that environment. And they're generally the ones that are exposed to the harm that the design or the asset poses or might be able to manage. But who are they? Well, the researchers could find no clear list that describes these people for the construction sector. They're not very well identified. And even in construction delivery, there are many different trades, and depending on the nature of the project, there are many different types of end user. So, of course, it can be quite difficult. For example, the end users for hospitals can be very different from the end users of office buildings. But being able to manage the safety risks encountered by those downstream stakeholders in the design requires an understanding of the work that they do, whether that's construction, healthcare, working in factories and so on. And there's a need to understand the risks that they might face in the work that they do if you want to cater for that in the design up front. To take a step further, it also means understanding the capabilities of those people in the work that they do and the circumstances within which they undertake their work. And that's a core function of the idea of health and safety by design, reflected in the diagram. It's about understanding the activities that will occur during construction, operation and maintenance, and in theory, disposal or end of life. And then bringing that knowledge into the design phase so that it can be accessed and then mitigations applied in the design for those risks that are best managed by that design. It also recognises that some risks to health and safety are best managed by the downstream stakeholders. But importantly, those risks that are cheaper and more effective to eliminate and minimise in the design are done in the design.
So the question we're left with is, how can designers access that knowledge from those people downstream? And so research has shown that engineers and architects tend to rely most heavily on their own experience in standards and codes. But engineers and architects aren't experts in downstream work and use, and certainly cannot identify all health and safety hazards present during the design phase. So standards and codes as well are not always up to date or fully comprehensive, and are not always that great at anticipating the downstream stakeholders' diverse needs. We often encountered the assumption that compliance with the building code, the New Zealand Building Code, is sufficient, and this is a common misconception. The involvement of downstream stakeholders is important to address gaps in designers' knowledge, but we know this doesn't always happen. Their input could be obtained in multiple ways. How do designers know when to engage with them directly? How do constructors and clients know when they really should be pushing to get access into the design process? And what are the barriers to downstream stakeholder involvement? Downstream stakeholder input seems to depend on the industry, delivery model, and maturity of the client. We observed that mature asset owning clients, those with sufficient scale, incentives, capabilities, and resources, are using a variety of methods to bring downstream stakeholder knowledge into the design process, including utilising in-house expertise, developing tailored in-house design standards, or adopting novel supply chain models to connect designers with downstream stakeholders. We appreciate not all clients have the capacity or incentives to apply these methods. So if you look at this diagram, opening up the design process to wider perspectives and knowledges is challenging. Aside from the logistical challenges of making the right people available to challenge the design and its assumptions, this opening up comes up against other pressures and incentives, such as time and cost constraints. These compel the project team to close the design down in order to achieve a design output that meets the anticipated schedule and budget. From this perspective, the idea that health and safety comes first is a myth. In reality, health and safety is squeezed by other imperatives.
Yeah, there are many reasons to make our assets safe, and there are many reasons to inform downstream stakeholders of the risks that they might need to know about associated with that design that were unable to be catered for due to that squeeze that Anna just talked about. One reason is the Section 39 of the Health and Safety Work Act requires that designers provide information about the design and its risks to downstream stakeholders. Participants in the study described a variety of ways that they currently do this. Firstly, sometimes there's little or no communication. In some cases, designers will send vague and non-specific and largely unhelpful messages, such as wear PPE when undertaking this activity. Some participants described using deliverables such as drawings and digital BIM to draw attention to the identified risks to health and safety. Some participants use site walkthroughs to engage downstream stakeholders in the details of the design and negotiate the particular hazards or issues they might face during construction or operation. And one method of communication was to put all of the health and safety risks identified during design into a register. We note that the register serves the needs of the designer, including helping them exercise their Health and Safety at Work Act obligations. However, the approach does not generally fulfill the direct needs of the downstream stakeholders. Rather, the downstream stakeholders need to know what are the residual risks in the design related to construction, operation, and maintenance. What are the limitations of the design and the assumptions about how it will be used so that the stakeholder can identify their own risks? And what are the special conditions or methods that are necessary to control the risk that the designer knows about that the downstream stakeholder may not? The research suggests that design services engage with downstream stakeholders about what works for them in relation to communication, so that the information about the design is accessible and useful and enables those downstream stakeholders to understand the risks that they might face and best manage them.
So there's a lot on the slide, but sometimes showing complexity of an issue is necessary, and this kind of broadly encapsulates what we've found. So during our research, we asked questions about how and when health and safety by design is done, and participants told us health and safety by design is being done on some projects and is at least sometimes useful. We deliberately asked wider questions about how and when health and safety matters are addressed in design, because sometimes people don't identify with health and safety by design that well as a concept, and it's important to to broaden it out. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we found that health and safety by design is not the only activity or aspect of the design process that addresses health and safety. So there are many other things being done which contribute to generating a healthy and safe design. Health and safety are, for instance, addressed by specific requirements and regulations or design standards, or through other targeted design studies such as HAZOPs or road safety audits. There are also many factors at different levels, so that's the upper left there, which enable or constrain the realization of a healthy and safe design. It's complicated, but if we want to understand design, then we can't ignore these things. Most are outside the traditional technical design bubble inhabited by engineers and architects. One key factor we noted is while good design undoubtedly depends on the capabilities and experience of the design services, it's also a function of how design is directed, enabled, and controlled by the client. In particular, the client organization makes critical early decisions, which determine project settings before professional design services are engaged and before health and safety by design is even thought about. So that's that in the bottom of the screen there. So these include the decisions to build and invest, the project objectives and constraints, the selection of the client's project team and design services suppliers, and choice of delivery model and contracting terms. These early decisions shape the design process in fundamental ways, including what can be achieved by health and safety by design, or indeed whether health and safety by design is done at all. In this regard, we argue that the idea that design is what happens between the beginning of concept and end of detailed design is a misconception. Those early client decisions are very much design decisions. Ultimately, it is the design process that generates a well-designed asset, one that is healthy and safe to construct, operate, maintain, and use. Health and safety by design can inform good design, but it is necessarily just a supporting act. Unfortunately, existing health and safety by design guidance is, in our view, inadequate. It generally positions health and safety by design as a standalone process, often reduced to a simplified 1 or 2-stage workshop-based activity, perhaps supported by generic checklists of considerations for health and safety with respect to the design of structures and plant. The guidance essentially ignores the wider design process and its context, and neither adequately instructs practitioners on how to integrate health and safety into their design processes, nor how to produce a healthy and safe design.
Importantly, it's good to understand where harm is being created, and so that you might create an intervention on how to prevent that harm. As Doug mentioned earlier, the harm statistics in New Zealand aren't getting any better, and we would like to find a way to better manage harm in the sector. The researchers looked at all the different schemes for identifying harm in the construction sector, as well as how the sector is described at the national level, and that included looking at the principal sources of data related to harm and exposure in New Zealand across work and the construction sector itself. The researchers had hoped to be able to examine what harm is occurring and where, which parts of the sector, what is the nature of the work that's occurring that's leading to that harm. The aspiration was to inform one of the greatest opportunities to improve health and safety outcomes through some potential interventions. However, they were unable to do that. The level of detail and the way the data is described and presented makes it nearly impossible to identify specific areas for intervention. That's a really important point. The construction sector is not clearly enough defined. We can't trace the activities to the work that's being done and the harm that's being created from those activities. It's not currently possible to see which types of construction, which parts of the sector, or which workers or users suffer the most harm that could be eliminated or minimized through design interventions. The observations on this are presented in chapter 4 of the report, which is worth specifically focusing on. The researchers suggest a number of areas where data and reporting on the sector needs to improve and align. Firstly, align the scope and subcategorization of the construction sector across reporting paradigms. That includes aligning the descriptions of the activities that occur in the sector with better descriptions of the people in the sector, including being able to align them to the activities that they undertake. One point of note is that day labourers are grouped in collectively and are largely unable to be attributed to any specific activity, any specific part of the sector. They're just one big lump, and we get a general idea on what the harm looks like from them. But it doesn't enable you to create any meaningful interpretation of that. Additionally, the alignment of harm to the people and being able to trace that back to the activities and the part of the sector that they worked in. Ultimately, addressing these needs is fundamental to enabling the definition, justification, planning, and prioritisation of all interventions to reduce harm across the sector.
The report argues that if the desired outcomes are designs that are healthy and safe, then the focus should be on how health and safety is addressed through the design process and the broader project context, and the levers that can be pulled at the project, organisational, sector and government levels to promote healthy and safe design. So it proposes a number of strategic directions for intervention in this regard. The first one talks about, so we acknowledge that, as John mentioned, we acknowledge that others may see things differently and may not agree with us, and that's cool. By socialising this report, we'd like to promote debate so that others can test the findings and questions we raise and help shape future work to make progress in this space. The second one, Russell was talking a bit about it just now, establishing a coherent understanding of what constitutes the construction sector in New Zealand and its performance to enable evidence-based change. And note, this does include how we understand people, their work and the harm they experience. The third one is about moving away from the notion that health and safety is addressed by occasional objective and systematic risk assessment when a design has been substantially conceived, to instead thinking about how to integrate health and safety through all aspects of design in context sensitive ways. So that's understanding that the context for projects can differ wildly actually, and it's really important because sometimes we think of things from we often as humans think of things from our own experiences, and I acknowledge that my experiences are in much larger projects, but smaller projects have a very different context, and different large projects, depending whether from commercial or other areas, also have distinctive characteristics. So the fourth one, orienting attention to the downstream stakeholders, those people downstream, by making them visible and by considering the knowledge of the downstream activities, how that's best accessed and how downstream stakeholders are engaged and informed about the design. The fifth one is looking at what can be done to promote desired behaviours within the construction sector, like the supply chain. So including incentivising and supporting clients to procure, drive and manage good design process, and consultation, coordination and cooperation between parties involved in design and construction. The sixth is exploring how and when design decisions, including point of no return decisions, are performed for construction projects and what this means for reasonably practical. And closing the loop, the last one, encouraging organisations, the sector and government to draw on their learnings and make this knowledge accessible for design, as well as increasing designers' awareness of their limitations of their own experience and the inherent limitations of the standards, including the misconceptions about compliance with the building code. I note that we did talk to a number of people, and a lot of organisations recognise taking their learnings and working from them and learning from is really important, but it's certainly something they could do better. So it's definitely an area of interest as well.
So look, really that's the end of the, if you like, the more formal presentation part of the webinar, where we just thought it was worth having Anna and Russ just describe some of the key features of the report, the key findings of the report. So where next? So we have this report. One of the key things for us is that, this is just the start of a much broader piece of work that needs to happen about the construction industry. And actually, we're in that situation at the moment as to kind of wondering and discussing, what do we do next? What's the most important thing to do? Where, there's a limited amount of energy that we can put into this. So where would that energy make the most difference? These are the things that we're wondering about. So currently, the situation where we're in at the moment is that we are seeking some funding for a further piece of work to add more detail onto those 7 directions to more focus where we might be able to achieve and facilitate some change. We're also in the process of consulting CHASNZ board, where we've got the privilege of having people like Doug and others that represent construction businesses across the industry and clients to get a governance input into where we think the project is going. But the most important thing, as I mentioned at the beginning, is really that we get some direction and some ideas from you, the stakeholders, who are either watching this webinar live or engaging in watching the recording to give us some input on where we think we should go in the future. And so that funding, we think, is probably nearly there. So we're pretty much ready to start that next piece of work. And what we're really keen to do is do something, meaningful and practical, take some action so that we can actually see some evidence of some change. So we'll kind of go into a more of a discussion mode for the webinar now. So I can see that we've got a question from the group already, and I'll probably angle this first of all to Russ, just because it's what he was talking about, which is how well do we measure the group that the health and safety message is being delivered to actually understands what's being said, or are we just assuming that people get it? Russ, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, if we are talking about this idea of communicating from the design to the end users, it's poorly understood, right? There's probably challenges on both sides. There's probably challenges around the messages that we send to those people, whether they are captured in a reasonable way that anybody might pick up and read. Sometimes they're written down, sometimes they're communicated verbally, but often we don't know who the messages are going to or how well they are received. The question sort of poses the right sort of frame, is we don't know if they're understood. And it comes back to that point around engagement, right? There is an opportunity to improve engagement, to make sure that when you talk to someone or when you give them a message, that they understand that message, maybe through reading it back to you or through some sort of shared dialogue. So in short, no, it's not measured, it's not well understood. It's definitely an area for improvement.
So that's really interesting. So that there's potentially messages from the design process that need to reach these downstream stakeholders, and that's proving really difficult to actually assure ourselves that that message is being received by those different people. And I suppose, Anna, you made this point that in that communication is that's fine, but we may not even at the design stage know and fully understand who these downstream stakeholders are and what they do.
Yeah, and also sometimes the designers have done the design, they walk away, and the information is then given to, and so there's not that continuity as well. So it's that conversation is often just doesn't happen actually, because so that's we talk to some people, especially like in residential as well, where the design is just passed on to them. And they don't have an opportunity to engage with the designer very much in that.
Doug, have you got any thoughts about how we do that better?
I think there's some things here which are really quite critical in terms of, particularly around perhaps upstream client education, and that comment that the client frames up the outcomes for this health and safety journey right from the start. And I think in my experience working in some petrochemical industries and doing work on petrochemical sites and in mining, where the client is actually quite aware of the downstream implications of decision making, we see a much better transfer of information and understanding. However, once we go into different areas of work, there are many clients who, once they've got the design, the questions about what the design means and what the implications of what is given away by design is often not had. And I think quite often the assumption is that if you've met the code, you've got a safe design. That the code is just a code. It doesn't answer the questions for how you're going to use the site or use the building. And and I think, I'm thinking of the flooding we've just experienced through Auckland. we went to a property which the design culvert was reduced on the understanding that if it got clogged, it would have an overland flow. Everybody that used the site didn't understand that the overland flow was there in case the culvert blocked and would block in a decent rainstorm, and they utilised that part of the site without understanding. And so this downstream user communication was a failure all the way through the system. It wasn't actually poor design, it was actually designed quite well. But the risk of what happened when the design no longer would cope with the water, the over discharge site wasn't actually managed properly. So that this key communication, and actually I think clients, and I think it's a big question for asset owners and people who are at the front end of design to ask the question is, what is an acceptable outcome if things go wrong? And 9 times out of 10, the answer will be very different to what the designers produce, because the design is optimized to a minimum code standard. So I think there's a really complex area to work in there, and I think a lot of responsibility for change needs to come in behaviour at the client end.
Yeah, that's a great insight. I'm going to go to some of the questions that have come in, just so I don't miss anyone. And so the first question's from Debbie. Hi, Debbie. So from this report, it said, how do we ensure the design process engages the downstream stakeholders when the majority of the design is undertaken prior to even tendering with construction companies? So I like this question because well, mainly because I've got the same question in my head, which is that, and I hear this a lot, which is that, hey, look, I'd love to consult with the constructor, but we haven't procured and I'm worried about conflict of interest is one example of a barrier to not engaging these, or not being able to engage that downstream expertise, if you like. Russ, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Debbie's highlighted a key point, and it's an observation that's been made in the report and also, you know, in my general experience, is that the designer is often put into a very tight little container, and their ability to communicate with even people within the client organisation is sometimes limited, and also with downstream organisations, whether it be end users or the constructors. That is a limitation of the existing delivery models that are in place that they're actually reinforcing some of the negative behaviours that this report seeks to sort of crack out and expose. Another thing that's tightly related to that is if you've ever hired a design contractor, they are motivated to get as many people on the job on day one as they can, because they've been sitting hungry for a few weeks while the bid and selection process has gone through. The procurement team have wanted to make sure that they've got a team ready to go, and they get in, they start designing, right? And because they're motivated to, right? That's normal. If I could ask for one thing, it would be some sort of cooling off period where you spend time understanding some of the more intricacies around what the risks are downstream, and involving that in the process up front somewhere. Of course, that's a big ask, right? Putting a pause point in a project to do that, and how big that pause point is would vary depending on the complexity and the nature of risks. And there would be certain designers that would say, oh, we've had these pause points, dozens of them, we don't need any, we can be more efficient in our delivery. So it gives them an unfair commercial advantage. The point is that our current delivery models do reinforce some of these negative outcomes that we're actually trying to manage and overcome.
Yeah, and certainly funding, you know, funding, it's, we've heard, you know, that the funding is for the designer, and then the funding is for the constructor, and then only then may the constructor sometimes talk to the designer. So it's there are some, I think it's important to acknowledge some fairly harsh realities that exist in the construction sector, and think about how, some of them can be better managed. It may not be even perfect, but yeah.
And Doug, what do you think about this in terms of the fact that the report points out that the designer's not necessarily got expertise in the work that's done during the construction, maintenance and operation phase, and often it's difficult for them to access that expertise? What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, I think this is just highlighted across our industry, and my personal opinion is that I think as we get more specialisation in designers, we're actually going to see this get exacerbated as we go forward. I think if we go back 20, 30 years, a lot of designers actually came from construction companies or had been out in the field and done some work and seen how things were built. And a lot of designers now coming straight out of university and doing fantastic design on paper, but their experience on a construction site is limited. I also think the other way it plays out is that I think we have a challenge with the construction. The people doing the building don't actually understand the journey the designer goes through. So they don't actually understand the language, and they might talk the same words, but I think they talk past each other when they come back. So I think that the way we contract and procure work at the moment, I think for work that we do repetitively and a lot of, that separation might be okay because the experience can transfer, but a lot of the specialist work we do is quite bespoke. And once it's bespoke, I think our procurement packages at the moment are actually creating a problem, which is, and then coupled with the fact that we can't actually work out where injury happens because the injury statistics relate to the person who employed them, not what they were doing at the time, just exacerbates this disconnect. So I think we've got a real challenge in changing how we do procurement, and we need to think, I think this is where again we need clients, particularly those who are doing bespoke work, think differently about the procurement process.
Awesome, thanks, Doug. I'll keep going. We've got so many people providing input that I'm not sure we're going to have time to get to everyone. So I'll just whip through a few questions. First of all, from Mike, who's joined us from the United States. So hi, Mike, and thank you for dialing in. Gosh knows what time it is for you, so thank you. Mike is asking, I'm curious, is if New Zealand's doing anything in the engineering and architecture educational sector and or the professional development for designers regarding safe design. I'm certainly not familiar with that. Any of the panel want to take that on?
I can talk to it. So firstly, for those that are also here, Michael was one of the foundational theorists for the idea of health and safety in design. So it's certainly an enormous pleasure to have him join our session. Secondly, to answer your question, Mike, it seems pretty weak. I remember engaging with a couple of universities a while ago around the content that's being taught in their various engineering schools, and they're always getting people coming along to them saying, hey, you also need to teach this, you also need to teach that, whether it's sustainability, safety and design, cost management, project management, dealing with people, contracts, all that kind of stuff. So there seems to be a bit of pressure to cater for a range of external stakeholders and what they think they need to be taught. Certainly not aware of any universities in New Zealand teaching what you are currently teaching at your university in the way that you teach it. So there's definitely an opportunity for you to come to New Zealand, partner up with one of our universities and share some of your knowledge. So thank you.
Yeah, I think we'd be definitely up for that if you're up for a visit to New Zealand. So moving on to another question, which is close to my heart as a health and safety professional, is where can we get more learning on what good health and safety and design and what failed health and safety and design looks like to educate our project teams before going into the design stage of a new build? Anybody want to take that on? Because I'll take that on myself and say that I'm actually not quite sure. I mean, I think this is kind of part of the challenge for health and safety generalists in particularly supporting construction design or construction processes, is that our traditional education and training just does not cover this sufficiently. We're not experts at design unless that you have fortunate experience such as I do. I used to do design as an engineer, so at least have some insight, but fundamentally it's kind of missing from education and training for safety professionals. Anyone else got any thoughts on that?
I think this is touching on one of the key issues we have to, one of the things that CHASNZ is looking to do, saying, how do we actually tackle some of these things? Because one of the challenges we've got is that whilst that stuff might happen in education and the theory of good practice comes out, we also have the experiences that once people come out of those training institutes, once they've spent 2 months in the job environment, that's all beaten out of them, and they're conforming to the standard process that we work through, because that's the way things are done. And so I think we actually have to tackle this, and I think it's one of the challenges that we in the report identified, is we're not sure where to start, and we're looking for a bit of guidance as to say, actually, where does the industry think, where does the collective intelligence of the people listening in the room think that focus would be best to get change? Because we need to change several places at once to make the change effective. But equally, there's a few more places where we're going to make more pressure. And I think one of the other things too is just that socialization. The more people talk about the misconceptions, the more likely we are to see some of the other changes get implemented and travel through. So this is a wicked space.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that just changing the process, like within a project, is, you know, it's that's why we talk about the different levels, like project level, organizational level, you know, industry, government, is that it's important to think about, well, what things support and what things don't support me getting something done in health and safety by design. We do have some examples of what people have suggested that they have had success in sort of how they manage their health and safety by design process in the report. But certainly I agree, it's always very helpful to have some real life examples as to what people are doing, and what has worked and why hasn't, like really people being very honest about why things haven't worked as well. And I've experienced that myself in my work when things actually haven't worked, and there are significant pressures, like I talked about in terms of time and cost and things like that, like the inevitable kind of happens, and then sometimes things just don't get the attention you desire.
Thanks, Anna. I'll keep with you, Anna, actually, because I've got a question here from Nick, which I think is such interesting too, which is the challenge that Nick sees with safety and design is how to apply it across smaller projects. And you were talking about this context, Anna. You know, you can develop a system that covers very large projects, but how to effectively apply a process to small projects where the fees aren't big, you know, big enough to allow a detailed process. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's like, I mean, the reality is, even for some of the large projects, we've heard that they don't do staging. So, you know, so there'll be guidelines where you, the NZCIC guidance where, you know, there are these stages, but actually there are commercial pressures and they don't stage those either, you know. So like smaller projects with all the resource constraints, for sure, that's where that context sensitive guidance. So looking at, oh, okay, what's the reality for a smaller commercial or build, like, so a bog standard residential build, I mean, that has a very different look to it as well. So it's just making kind of like, how can we make sense of those things and do something that's really practical, and yeah, like for the particular work that you're doing. In smaller projects, for sure, I think we often hear all these great stories about these large sexy projects, big money and all this other stuff, and it's just like we tend to forget. That's why, like in the report as well, we looked at the values in the different parts of the construction sector, and residential is, I think, over 50%, and you know, that's massive. And so then it's like, well, if you look at how things are happening, like, you know, the values in small commercial builds and perhaps where the harm is happening and things like that, you know, how do we actually help, you know, those people manage those projects in a manner that actually makes sense. So yeah, I think.
John, I've got a thought on that as well, which actually is, we quite often think about a process and create more perhaps bureaucracy around process. I think one of the key findings of the report is the key amongst this is actually the decision and what information informs a decision. And it doesn't matter if it's a big site or a small site, that the implications of safety need to inform decision making as part of the design conversation as much as cost and time does. And at the moment, we are putting crudely health and safety as a bit of work that fits into design, rather than bringing it into the same level of conversation as that is held around cost and program. And so on a small project or a big project, the absence of that safety conversation is absolutely where I think the failing is starting to unpack.
Yeah, you have to integrate it to be efficient. You know, you don't want to be doing it as a really, like workshops are really labor intensive, resource intensive, you know, so thinking about things that you can do that aren't, that really fit within that, your typical work, like, you know, how you're managing time and cost, but yeah, in a more effective way.
I just want to add one more sort of lens to that conversation. We often talk about projects being small projects or large projects, and that's how we frame our effort. You know, we say, oh, large projects, they're bigger, they're more affordable for this type of effort as a percentage of the fee, right? That's how we think about things. But we really should start thinking about projects in terms of the risk that they pose. Sometimes very expensive projects are very normal and everybody understands the risks involved and they're well understood and they are easily managed through the design. But sometimes there are small projects that are unique, bespoke, and pose significant risk. So that could be a small substation in an area that hasn't had one before, using contractors that you haven't used before. That's more risky than, say, a housing development with pretty standardized processes that underpin it and a handful of risks that propagate right across each build. So I think it's worthwhile thinking about taking a risk-based approach in terms of your effort rather than a cost or size-based approach.
Totally agree. Because of how organizations work around delegated financial authorities and their obsession with like procurement and value of an item or what a project, they tend to organize their portfolio and with regards to how much something is costing, rather than thinking about that, like you're talking about those novel things or riskier things that and so yeah, it's absolutely we do talk about that as like making sure that you're not just dealing with lots and lots of stuff that is inconsequential, when really like, hey, what's different here, what's important to focus our attention on.
That's great. We're moving into our last 5 minutes, so I'm going to just ask one more question, which was I think a good one, which was raised in our Q&A from Jen, which is, can you give some tangible examples of any alarming, insightful, emotive conversations you had with designers during your research? Anna, you did most of the interviews, so basically I think this is a dish the dirt question. So have you got any examples?
I think probably what for me was most striking is talking to the constructors and realizing well, you kind of know, but you don't know, like, you know, and it's really, and also I only have done work in certain spaces within the sector. So it's like just the reality of not actually having a lot to do with anything in the design, or not even knowing, not even be given the information. Like would say, oh, how well did, you know, did you get that information, or did you, do you know who actually did that work, and do you understand, you know, things like that, how little they actually feel part of the process, or like get the have the ability to gain understanding of what happened before they got the design. Is actually and also it's like we've talked about it earlier, like Doug was talking about it as well, it's that kind of them and us. It's that kind of disappointment at not being part of the conversation, because they think like constructors in a really difficult place, because they're in that short-term space between design and the use. You know, it's a really difficult industry, you know, ups and downs, and they're squeezed financially and stuff. And it's like just the perceptions of them and us kind of thing. And that's probably, I found that, yeah, that kind of, that people did talk about like, oh, this happened, and I said there was something wrong and no one did anything about it, you know, like that kind of because the design was too far along. And you think, gosh, why didn't someone think of that earlier? And for sure that happened, and I can't really disclose exactly what, but it does seem to be quite like people who kind of are more construction oriented, or like maintenance, like construction is often quite maintenance oriented as well. They kind of go, oh, why didn't anyone pick that up? And thank goodness it wasn't any more expensive or took longer for us to figure out how to fix it in construction. Yeah, you know, sometimes they could, sometimes they couldn't, but yeah, it was certainly interesting.
I can add a direct example myself from a site I was on last week, where the designers had designed some rebar that was at 20 mil, but anybody that's worked with rebar knows that 20 mil rebar is 23 mil. And, you know, just that one simple detail has just led to so much error in the reinforcing bar that actually it's forcing the contractor to try and fix that on site while they're building it. Just generates so much risk. and you could actually just see it in front of you. There's these little things that slip through. Right, look, we're towards the end of this session. What I will promise to our attendees that have sent us questions that we haven't answered, because there were so many, so thank you for the input. And there's a ton of suggestions on direction of travel for us as well. So I really appreciate that. And anybody that's got anything that they want to add after the event, you can email us at info@chaznz.org. With your questions, comments, suggestions. Really interested to hear it. You know, whatever your point of view is, it'd be really welcome for us. Particularly if you think we've gotten anything wrong, or you think that we need to add anything to the report that's missing. You know, always happy to hear that. So look, I'll just wrap up now by thanking our expert panelists for coming along and talking about this, and thanking everybody for taking some time out of your day, or in the case of Mike in the US, taking time out of his night probably to do this. So thank you very much, and I'll sign us off here, I think.